Arbitrum is the home of DeFi.
How can you make sure that all of these network effects are synergistic with one another?
Ethos that we've had is always bend to developers. Don't ask developers to bend to you.
Why should people choose to build on Arbitrum Orbit specifically?
Welcome back to the Rollup, your home for technical talks and open conversations that shape the modular future. Nothing on today's show is to be construed as financial advice. You can see our full disclosures list at therollup.co/ventures. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode after a quick word from some of our awesome partners.
Redstone modular oracles are available on 50+ chains, trusted by over 100 clients, and over $6 billion in total value secured. Visit redstone.finance to find out more.
Well, guys, welcome to Thailand. We're in Bangkok at Arbiverse. Thanks, Steven, for hosting this great event.
Great event. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, man. I mean, the Arbitrum ecosystem, a couple years ago started with an airdrop and is now a massive research airdrop rollup deployment, and is now a massive community. How are you feeling about the vibes at DevCon, Ethereum, and just broader?
Yeah, so the Arbitrum ecosystem started years before the airdrop, right? So,
Oops.
you can go back on YouTube and find the very first mention of Arbitrum from a fall 2014 Princeton semester, and that wasn't the beginning. Ed, came up with the idea a year prior at a Princeton Bitcoin workshop. And the reason I like to mention that video is Ethereum went live July of 2015. So, Ed was really thinking about scaling smart contracts, but before there were smart contracts, it was very academic. Ed went off to the White House for 2 years, and then in 2017, when he came back, Ed was the deputy CTO of the US and senior advisor to President Obama. And 2017, when he came back, Harry and I said, hey, let's actually build that Arbitrum thing, because at that point there was an Ethereum, there were smart contracts. We were starting to actually see the pain points of scaling. We thought, things like 𝗵𝗶𝗴𝗵-𝗃, if you remember that era. And that's when we really started building. And definitely to see an event like this today at Arbiverse, it's crazy to see. I remember our first conferences, we were so proud of ourselves that we managed to get a branded tablecloth. So we've come a long way as a community, as an ecosystem, as a technology stack, and fantastic to see not only the cool venue, but all the many people here that are part of the Arbitrum ecosystem.
One of the things that, Steven, I like about you is that I think you're a great storyteller. And so kind of to trace where Arbitrum came from, this 2014 Princeton paper, and to see what it's exploded into now. I mean, it's evolved quite a bit from that academic point of view into and then you pick up from there. How would you say that things have evolved since that academic point of view, and take us up until now?
Yeah, so remarkably, I'd say some of the most basic and fundamental core ideas actually date back to that paper. The fraud-proof mechanism, the interactive fraud proofs that Arbitrum is invented and have now become the way to do an optimistic rollup. That was at one point contentious, but today everyone agrees that Arbitrum's way, that actually goes back to the initial designs and is in the Arbitrum paper. Some of the, a lot of learnings of actually building something in production. So there are definitely a lot of things in the paper that weren't quite ready. In particular, in the paper, when you're writing a paper, you don't need to actually make it work for the end user with the integrations. You just say, okay, we have this theorized L1, and you build this L2 on top of it that can launch smart contracts. But when we're actually building for users and developers, we have to think about, okay, what do users and developers want? And that's actually one of the main differentiators of Arbitrum. That was true back when we were launching in 2021, and true today, is we constantly say, which we didn't do in the academic paper, not how do we make a system that works and has these properties, but how do we make one that has an additional property that developers want to use it. And the ethos that we've had is always bend to developers, don't ask developers to bend to you. And that actually manifested itself in 2021. So now you think EVM rollups, yeah, everyone's building an EVM rollup. That's just the thing to do. You rewind a few years, that was a highly controversial point. There was exactly one team and one rollup that was building for the EVM, and that was Arbitrum. Other people were doing their own languages. Some were only for payments or transfers of a particular type of asset. Some were had Solidity, but had their own compiler, and it was kind of similar to EVM, but had significant differences. There was one that said no. And the reason I think why Arbitrum got the adoption that it got initially and continue to today is because of that ethos to bend to developers. And people saw, hey, I could just take my code from Ethereum or any other EVM chain, and I could just deploy this at Arbitrum. That's amazing. That works. And now today with Arbitrum Stylus, we've actually taken that a step further, where we said, all right, we've got the EVM folks covered, but what about zoom out the rest of the world? Because I don't know about you, but I'm in like this like super Twitter bubble where I think Solidity developers are the entire world. But my team tells me that there's millions of other developers out there apparently that the algorithm doesn't show me that actually write in other languages. And in all seriousness, there are about a few tens of thousands, maybe 30,000 Solidity developers out there estimated to be, 3 million Rust developers out there, 12 million C and C++ developers out there. And the right thing to do initially was to say, how do we bend to the EVM developers? And that will stay there, right? The EVM is not going anywhere. But the question we ask ourselves now is, okay, who else can we bend our technology to? Can we bend to the Web 2 developers? Can we give them the technology they need? It's not only about the developers, it's also about the code that they've written. Can I go to a company and say, hey, you've built this awesome game engine written in C. You know what? You don't have to re-implement that. You could become an on-chain game and take the code that you spent the last decade writing. And that's always our ethos. It was true for EVM folk, it was true for today. And again, the EVM is not going anywhere. We're just constantly saying, all right, we have this core. How do we grow from there, and how do we actually get those users on chain?
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the story is this scaling Ethereum and giving developers the tools to build in execution environments that are highly scalable for new innovative applications, and then now moving into Stylus and other fronts. And that kind of prompts me to what I'd like to set the foundation for the rest of this talk, which is like, Arbitrum as a tech stack is now much bigger than what it was when Arbitrum 1 went live, to the point where there's things going on which I may not even be aware of. How can we conceptualize what Arbitrum tech stack is at its core, and kind of what these like spokes are to the Arbitrum hub, if you will, or even better, what is the right way to think about this Arbitrum stack that you guys have built? What is your narrative there?
Absolutely. So the Arbitrum stack, so there's products and there's technology. I'll start with the technology. So today, and since 2022, so a year after launch, the core Arbitrum technology platform is Arbitrum Nitro. So initially there was something called the Arbitrum Virtual Machine, the AVM, and that went live in 2021. But in 2022, we launched Arbitrum Nitro, which is WASM-based or WebAssembly based. Back then, we didn't have any WebAssembly contracts. It was all EVM, but underneath the fraud proving was all done in WebAssembly at that point. And then fast forward to today, so I mentioned Arbitrum Stylus, where we've added a second VM. So there's all this buzz and all this talk out there about alt VMs on chain.
We're bullish.
Yes, I've seen some of your tweets. Arbitrum has, I think, the best of both worlds because it has a dual VM. It has the EVM and it has an alt VM. And the alt VM has some fantastic properties. So for example, you can write, as I mentioned, contracts in Rust and C and C++. You also get a 10x, so 10x performance benefit for computation when you do that. So a lot of really good features. So that's the core Arbitrum stack today. So yes, it's grown a lot from initially the AVM through Arbitrum Nitro that was WASM based through now Stylus that actually gives developers access to WASM and lets them write WASM-based contracts today in Rust and C and C++, but that's a platform that's extendable. So if we, Move is a great language. There's nothing stopping Move from someone porting Move to Stylus and having Move contracts in Stylus as well. And actually, it's a platform that can innovate with, as developer toolings and languages innovate, Arbitrum will be able to support that the same way any WASM-based instance would. So very, very exciting there. And then...
so those are the technologies.
That's like the core technology. But as you know, building a chain is a lot more than just the core technology that writes smart contracts. You need to have a suite of other tooling. And some of it we can build, some of it we can't build, right? Some of it we can build, but we actually want to use popular infrastructure providers. So for example, yeah, we could build a block explorer ourselves, but Arbiscan is built by Etherscan, a much better block explorer. Same with nodes, same with RPCs. So the core technology is the Arbitrum Nitro stack, today enabled with Stylus that gives you the ability to write these smart contracts. And then the next level of this is, that's like the core technology, but then there's a question of how is this technology deployed? like, where is this technology deployed? How many instances of this technology are deployed? So initially, there was one instance of Arbitrum, which we called Arbitrum 1. And by the way, that name was from day one, so you might expect we always had, not that there will be something called Arbitrum 2, yeah, but like it was always obvious to us that there would be more than one instance of Arbitrum. And actually, going back just to the academic paper and how things have changed, in a few cases, we've actually zigzagged in interesting ways. I'll give you 2 examples, and then I'll get back to what we're actually talking about. But one example is there's all this talk today about based rollups. And I actually think that based rollups in their current form with pre-confirmations don't really make sense and have some serious issues. But the core idea that Ethereum can be a sequencer, if you want to deal with the Ethereum block time, certainly without pre-confirmations, but that's an old idea. And actually, if you look back at the Arbitrum paper, there was no sequencer. It was literally just using Ethereum for this. So that's one idea. But the one that I wanted to mention, which is related to the point here, is if you look back at the original Arbitrum academic paper, again, this is the paper that was published in 2018, but the culminations of ideas from 2013, there were envisioned to be many chains. The idea was there that you'd spin up a chain to do some poker game or some app, and then you'd spin down the chain, right? And actually, the initial you had these chains that were specific for not only applications, but for a specific instance of that application, and that was the way we thought about it back then. And then we realized that that the world's not ready for that vision today. We need to have one really strong chain where there's deep liquidity that DeFi can have synchronous interactions, and that became clear, and that's what led to Arbitrum 1. But ironically today, we're kind of getting back to that vision a little bit, where now there's, people are talking about base sequencing again. People are talking about, there's going to be 1 million chains. I just got back from a panel where someone was mentioning this idea of there being 1 million chains. And this is funny because that's actually, where we were then. But I actually have a more nuanced approach today, and it relates to our ecosystem and how it's deployed. So Arbitrum 1 is, you can think of it as the center. And it has deep liquidity, and there are some applications where it just makes sense to launch an Arbitrum 1. If you're a DeFi app that wants to tap into deep liquidity and synchronous interoperability with other applications, the other hundreds of DeFi applications in Arbitrum 1, that's where you want to be. But some teams, particularly teams that don't need that, might want to launch their own chains and might actually want to say, you know what, I'm going to, maybe I'm a game and I don't care as much about Interop. I'm going to go ahead and launch my very own chain on the Arbitrum stack. And we have a program there called Arbitrum Orbit, which gives developers the ability to actually launch their own chain. And then there's a question which, I'll pause here, but just to put out the question, which I'm happy to get to, is what is the interop story among these chains? How do they talk to one another? How does that develop over time? But ultimately, Arbitrum has the ability to do both a really good neutral, by the way, chain. Neutral means not controlled by any company on the application layer. It's a neutral chain, but also has the ability to launch your own chains. And it's really nice that we have this dual identity. I don't think actually anyone else has this dual identity. There are ecosystems that have a neutral platform, like Solana is a great example. There are ecosystems that have pushed you to launch your own chain, but there is no ecosystem that both has a neutral, successful chain that the chain operators are not also competing with you at the application layer, and also has the ability to graduate to your own chain. And one example of this working in practice, actually on my way walking over here, I just saw Amit from Proof of Play. They're building Pirate Nation. Really popular game on Arbitrum, crushing it. They're actually doing 2 chains today, but they actually started off in a different ecosystem, and they came to Arbitrum and got great fee reductions. But they started off on Arbitrum public chains. In their case, it was Arbitrum Nova, which is the gaming social public chain. But they started off on the public chains, outgrew that, but because they're in the Arbitrum ecosystem, because all their tech is built on the Arbitrum stack, they were fine to go ahead and just launch their own Orbit chains. And they launched an Orbit chain, and they outgrew that, and they launched a second Orbit chain, and to users they're getting a cohesive experience. But that's basically what we think about. There's Arbitrum 1 in the center, and then there's literally an orbit of chains around it today, on the order of 100 teams building chains around this orbit of Arbitrum chains.
Yeah, Ed mentioned it was a constellation, not a cluster. So just a heads up. A couple points. I mean, I think Rollup as a service providers have been crucial for the distribution of the Arbitrum technology. Those have absolutely blown up in popularity and usage over the last year. That has became a massive distribution channel for Arbitrum Orbit technology. And simultaneously, this like shift in developer thinking of, okay, I want to build an opinionated, kind of like purpose-built app-specific chain. I want to be on a place where I can inherit revenues from the sequencer. I want to have customizability, which I know a really cool chain is 𝗂𝗶𝗶𝗵 that has customized the block times from Arbitrum Orbit, another very successful one that we're quite close with. And so these kind of customizabilities, they come into builders who want to go and get those and have those properties. But then on the synchronicity, as you mentioned, that is where kind of like the main chain comes in. And so from my perspective, Arbitrum has dominated the DeFi application side on Arbitrum One. I mean, since inception, GMX, Gains, 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 was there. There's a ton of DeFi growth now. That there's way more names than I can keep track of. And then we're also simultaneously entering this potentially new regime of United States regulatory clarity, or at least the perception of such, that is allowing DeFi to enter into this perceived DeFi renaissance. So I'm curious from your perspective what the state of Arbitrum DeFi is today, and what are you guys doing to bring that even bigger and better going forward?
Arbitrum is the home of DeFi.
I agree.
And Arbitrum is the home of, I'll say, DeFi innovation. And that's like actually like the key here, right? Not the home of like copycat DeFi protocol, but if you want to build an interesting DeFi protocol that's different, that's unique, that's trying something new, Arbitrum is the most collaborative and the most liquid ecosystem to do that. So Arbitrum is DeFi is a really, really strong vertical in Arbitrum. But to get to your other point, so how does this all work together? So yes, you have customizability, particularly on the chain front. Is super important, and the way we think about how these work together, like so if I'm a DeFi app today, I'd probably want to launch an Arbitrum One, but there are other DeFi. 𝗂𝗶𝗃 you mentioned is a great example of DeFi existing in Arbitrum Orbit chains. So we think about, and they're doing, like you said, one of the nicest things about Arbitrum chains is the block time. So the public chains run at 250 milliseconds. The tech, though, is stable to run much, much faster. In fact, 𝗂𝗃, as you mentioned, is running the same tech stack that we support at 100 millisecond block times, which is like really good, because like if I'm, it's really good for them, because for DeFi and efficiency and arbitrage and Oracle updates, big difference. And actually, I think that's why perps succeeded in Arbitrum, was because of the fast block times. Really, really important, but actually good just for user experiences as well, right? If I'm a consumer-focused chain and I'm going to I'm targeting users that are Web2 users, whether it's a game or whether they're purchasing something, it doesn't really matter. I don't know about you, but if I go to Google and like search for something and it's been like, I don't know, 100 milliseconds and like I don't get a response, like, come on, refresh.
Smash that.
Yeah, exactly. We're all like, crypto users. So yeah, we get it. If I have to wait a couple of seconds, we're not going to freak out, but we don't want to stop at us, right? The same way we don't want to stop at Solidity. We don't want to stop at the community we have today. We want to bring the world on chain. We want to onboard the world to the blockchain with Arbitrum technology. And we have to think about what is the user experience they're going to need. And they're not going to want to wait for 2 seconds and say, all right, they're going to say, you know what? I don't like blockchain gaming, they're going to say, because my games used to be fast and now they're slow. So we can't sell these experiences if they're actually going to be a degradation user experience. And that's I think the reason why Arbitrum is taking off in gaming too. You can actually have a fully on-chain game like Pirate Nation and actually give users the same user experience that they want. So the one place where we have to think about though is, okay, what about the interoperability? Let's say there's a user that's in Arbitrum One that wants to be also in others. So I don't know if we're calling constellations or clusters, but typically we call them chain clusters. Is our idea of There's these ideas out there which are actually powerful, and we have our version is called chain clusters that allows you to couple chains more closely together. So you can have, say, 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 chains that trust each other and can actually synchronously interact, faster than the settlement time and get really good interaction. The problem
faster than the L1 settlement time?
Yes, and this is like think about it like in the optimism ecosystem. This is the super similar to the super chain.
Correct.
The problem that we have is we don't believe in like a super chain vision once and for all, because the problem is in order to do this you have to trust each other, because if 2 chains are communicating synchronously, if there's something goes wrong in chain A, there will be contagion to chain B.
Yeah, that's the problem with like pairwise basically.
Yes, and now you have like 10 chains or 100 chains in this cluster, and so think about innovation. 𝗂𝗃𝗃. Think about Phoenix building privacy, fully homomorphic encryption on chain. Now you have this one chain cluster, and what does it have? It has like, the biggest chains, say Arbitrum 1 in this chain cluster, and it's going to have enterprise chains and DeFi chains and NFT chains. And then this chain called Phoenix comes along and says, hey, I want to join this, but I also want to like make deep changes to the stack. They're going to say like, no, you can't do that in our chain cluster, because we have to actually trust, because if something goes wrong in what you're doing, it actually could affect us too. And the NFT teams are going to want to make changes that the DeFi teams don't really care for, and the DeFi teams are going to want to change things. NFTs, I don't want those changes in our chain. The gaming teams are going to have their own. So you have all these varied interests, and what happens is you don't accomplish anything. Those that are more prominent in the stack, those one or two chains, will control the roadmap, and everyone else will have to run the exact same tech stack. And actually, we've seen this in other ecosystems. There was a chain called the Public Goods Network by Gitcoin, and they shut down for a few reasons. But one of the reasons they said is they wanted to do royalties enforced on chain, but they couldn't get the governance ability to do that. So we believe at Arbitrum, your chain, your rules. There doesn't make sense to have a one cluster for all, because that stifles innovation. You won't have Phoenix. And you know what? We might know what the best technology of today is, but we don't know what the best technology of tomorrow is. And if we don't allow teams like Phoenix to try really radical but amazing and promising new bets, there's no way that we're going to advance. And I'm not ready to stifle innovation and say everyone should launch vanilla Arbitrum. So that's why the vision that we have among Interop are chain clusters. So the DeFi chains can synchronously interact with themselves if they choose to, self-selecting. The NFT chains can do that. The gaming chains can do that, and they all have the same interests and be much closer and much more willing to make changes. But there's no way that the DeFi chains and the NFT chains and the gaming chains and the privacy chains are going to make those changes for one another. So that's like our deep vision of Interop, and it's one that allows you to have customizability. And the last thing I'll say is, not giving up your governance and not giving up your ability to customize is like crucial, because even if you think today, like, it's okay, I don't want to do anything special, I want a vanilla chain, it's the optionality of the future that you also want as well.
Sovereignty,
that's why the sovereignty to make your own decisions, even if today you don't want to do anything special, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. And that's why I'm a big believer in the self-selecting chain cluster vision. And by the way, you know what the best example of a team that can cluster themselves? It's a team that is actually two chains run by the same team. They're naturally governed by the same team. They're naturally, so like, if Pyro Nation, Proof of Play wants to, they have two chains called Apex and Boss, sure, that's a natural cluster. They can get great UX benefits, operate and look to users as one chain, and they naturally trust each other. I think we can extend that a little more broadly than one team, a few gaming teams that have a similar vision, but there's no way that we're going to both simultaneously have innovation and everyone in a single chain cluster. And we're building an Interop future that doesn't stifle innovation, doesn't require you to give the keys up to your innovation to someone else.
One missing question mark real quick, Rob, is are these chain clusters then, like gaming cluster, for example, or proof of play cluster, then you've got DeFi, et cetera, are these also interoperable amongst each other?
So that's a great question. Yeah. So you have these different clusters
that are like very interoperable.
Right. But then our job is to say, okay, and how do we build the best-in-class interoperability between those as well?
Intercluster.
It won't quite be as good, right, as in a cluster,
right?
But it doesn't have to be, because the world isn't partitioned between NFT users and game users, DeFi users. The DeFi person also likes to play games. But where I keep my DeFi funds is largely here. Sure, sometimes I'm going to have to send funds there, and you want to have the best experience, that we can have there. And that's where, like, I don't know if we recently shipped a feature called fast withdrawals, which for Arbitrum any trust chain takes the withdrawal time down from what was 7 days, which is still 7 days in the Rollup, for any trust chain now down to 15 minutes. Awesome. Teams like Layer 0 and Across and Connext and a Hop can all tap into that. Now they have much more efficient bridging. So we put out at the infrastructure layer great tools and keep innovating there to make this asynchronous bridging as good as it can be, starting with sending coins and value to arbitrary message passaging, intent-based solutions. We just announced today our support for 7683.
Oh, congrats! It's awesome.
So I think that there's are all pieces to a much broader puzzle, and putting this all together. And by the way, the wallets and the apps, they all have a part of this as well. And it's really going to be, people talk about Interop as if there's this like one thing that's going to fall from heaven and we're all going to okay, this is Interop. But actually, it's a bit more of a messy game. It's all these really cool pieces working together. And a lot of that UX actually comes to the wallets to package that together for users and take all these great pieces and bits of technology and put forth the best path for users to actually do what they intend to do.
So the vision here is degrees of interop. And we have very close, almost a home of tightly connected chains for chains that are building in a similar domain. Gaming chains will coalesce around one another, DeFi, similar. And then those are interoperable, but it's almost a fractal vision where we have varying degrees of interop as you scale out. And so very tight network effects amongst those chain. I almost want to refer to them as parties rather than clusters, because it's like, you invite to your party these people that you want to be like-minded with and similar around. And then as you kind of branch out, you'll have different degrees of network effects as you zoom out. And so as you're thinking about Arbitrum as one collective family of chains, all of these parties and clusters are making up the Arbitrum ecosystem, how can you make sure that all of these network effects are synergistic with one another? They're obviously having very varying different degrees of interop among each other. And that interop will solve this fragmentation problem that we see between not just rollups, but also layer ones. Everything has kind of branched out as we get to the vision of 1 million rollups. And I think that is a vision that is pretty common that a lot of us are seeing into the future. It will be multi-chain. It potentially could be millions of rollups. And so, Interop is the solution for that. How are you thinking about value accrual in the Arbitrum stack and to make sure that it is, one collective home for the entire Arbitrum ecosystem? And all of that is synergistic with one another.
Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain. With the introduction of SafeNet, Safe is taking this to the next step very soon. Check out net.safe.global to learn more about how Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain.
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fraxtal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fraxtal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire Appchain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fraxtal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or mainnet into the Fraxtal mainnet. Bridge your tokens and bring your Frax assets into the Fraxtal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fraxtal. You are still early. Join today. Take part in our expedition into the singularity.
Okay, so two things to say here. Number one is the best analogy I have for this model is it's a data analogy, but TV channels, if you will. And the idea is, and I've posted this in the past, but the idea is you have your cartoon channel, Cartoon Network maybe, where you have your cartoons and you have your news channels. And it's okay to have a few news channels, right? It doesn't have to be one DeFi chain or one DeFi. There could be a few competing. That's great. And you have your, say, National Geographic channel. And by the way, there will be some cartoons about nature, right? There will be some NFT marketplaces, right? It's not always an exact science where you can put yourself in a bucket, but the idea is, we find these buckets, and it makes a lot of sense because, on the one hand, it doesn't make sense for every TV show to have its own channel, right? You'd have to now go and negotiate with the networks and with the advertisers. It would be crazy. Also, and they would be empty most of the day.
Right.
It also doesn't make sense for there to be one channel for everyone because not everyone wants to watch the same thing. We run into those really, to use the analogy, there's going to be no innovation. We're going to have to do the most boring thing that the most users want to use, and that's not going to be too exciting. So I think we find a model where you have this network of clusters that really solves the needs of users. And no one's saying you have to be in this channel. It's natural. That's where you go, and that's where you want to be. But in terms of how, I think the second part of the question was really about how do we make sure that there's alignment and these are all contributing to the same vision. Yes. This is actually where I want to talk about the Arbitrum licensing model, which I think the most innovative licensing model, in the space, and I think, it's really a lesson for how we can, as a community, think about, what licensing should be in Web3. So historically, licensing has been, software licensing has been very binary. There's open source and closed source, and that's it. And closed source, enterprises like because it gives them an edge, but it's bad because, it stifles open innovation. Others can't use your code, can't build it, they have to start from scratch. So people don't love closed source for good reason. Open source is great. I wrote the software stack. Anyone can build in it. Anyone can use it. Fantastic. Yes, but then you run into problems. And the problems that we've seen in the past, like sometimes there are these libraries, like sometimes crypto libraries that are often literally securing trillions of dollars of like corporate enterprise value.
Yes.
And like they have these like bugs, and you look and say like, who's maintaining this? And it's like, oh, it's like these like 3 like part-time, poorly funded developers, and like you say, like what's going on here? Like every big company, it's a tragedy of the commons, right? Everyone's relying on the software, but no one's actually contributing to it. And we've gotten better as an industry about this, but you can look through history and see these, and I'm sure that there are many more examples in the open source space today. So what we said in Arbitrum is, how do we solve this problem, right? How do we accomplish what we don't want? Closed source software. We want open source software in the sense we want there the freedom for users to use it, freedom to innovate, build what you want, customize what you want, do whatever you want. But we also want you to be, contributing back to the funding of the software, contributing back to the vision that's going to propel this forward. And the nice thing that we have in crypto that we didn't have before, in when you're just a software repository on GitHub, is now we have financial communities, treasuries around this. So the way that the Arbitrum software licensing work is we don't call it open source or closed source, we call it community sourced, right? It belongs to the community. It belongs to the Arbitrum community in this case. And you know what? If you want to go ahead and launch software, we're going to say, hey, you should contribute back to that community. So how does that work? If you're building an L3 on Arbitrum 1, which many of the Arbitrum orbit chains are, you're implicitly contributing back to the community because you're settling, your fees are going back to the Arbitrum 1. Those are collected. All the fees in the chain, by the way, go to the Arbitrum DAO on-chain treasury. It's also unique among rollups, the fact that all the accrual goes to the DAO treasury on-chain. So you don't need to do anything explicit. You're good to go and customize the software how you will. But let's say you don't want. Let's say you want to build an L2 on Ethereum. Now what? Well, you can just do that and use the software and grow and even compete with Arbitrum and never actually contribute anything back. So what you're asked to do is, hey, contribute like a meaningful but not too large part of your profits back to the Arbitrum DAO, what we call the Arbitrum Developer Guild, to fund development of this software. So you're asked to give 10% of your on-chain profits. So if you take your settlement costs, subtract those from your on-chain costs, and what you're left is your on-chain profit, 10% of that goes back to, again, the core community and core development of this software. And by the way, Arbitrum has become the default execution layer, not just on Arbitrum. If you look throughout the community, those who are launching layer 2s on Ethereum are predominantly choosing, the Arbitrum stack. I think the Arbitrum orbit today has 100+ chains, which is larger than any other ecosystem in terms of the number of chains building on it. And also, if you actually look even at our competitors' ecosystems, you find Arbitrum chains. There are Arbitrum chains, Arbitrum L3s on on Base. On Base, yes.
Settled
so
to Base.
If you actually look at some of their...
Were you going to say 𝗵𝗶𝗴𝗵
Yeah, sorry.
Is that chain real?
They are talking about Arbitrum L3s on 𝗵𝗶𝗴𝗵. I don't know.
Interesting. Some alpha here.
I believe. I've seen this. But on Base, they actually have live Arbitrum chains. You have Arbitrum chains on Base. Their biggest chains, right? The biggest L3s, Degen chain, which was quite big a couple months back.
Forecasting.
You have, yes, exactly. Blackbird, which is the restaurant app that's on Base. Arbitrum chain. So Arbitrum is not just the execution model of Arbitrum. Arbitrum is becoming the execution model of Ethereum and beyond. And how does that sustainable? How does that work? To your question, even if they're on orbit chain, certainly
as the execution it proliferates into these other ecosystems.
Right. So how does that work? Community sourced. That's fine. Go ahead. Do your thing. You don't need to ask me permission. You don't need to ask anyone permission. Go ahead. Self-serve. Innovation. Build where you want to build. But you know what? Be a part of the community and contribute back to the community that's making it all possible. And that's why I think a community source is, again, it wasn't possible before. Before there wasn't a financial community that you can coalesce around, right? Imagine saying on GitHub, you can fork my repo, but like, you just send me money, like, it doesn't work, right? But now it actually does work because all these communities are financialized.
So Steven, as we kind of come to a wrap up here, the last question, which I think we've answered in this entire show, but I'm definitely keen to understand like a short, like one or a couple liners here. Is Rob and I speak to builders who want to launch their own app chains on like probably weekly, like multiple times per week. It's a new builder that either we've invested in or that we are supporting in some capacity. The first question is always like, which RAS do I use? And it's like, which stack do I build on? So for those builders that are watching this, why should people choose to build on Arbitrum Orbit specifically? If I want to launch an app chain, I know we talked about a lot of it already, but why should I build on Arbitrum Orbit?
Great question. So yeah, and I'm glad to summarize it, because this is actually the most important question. And you know what? There's a lot of different chains out there, a lot of different communities, and a lot of conflicting information. So to make it concise, fastest block times, right? So you have 250 millisecond block times on the public chains, 100 milliseconds. Those aren't the fastest, by the way. 100 millisecond, we have examples of chains running. Those aren't the fast L2s. Those are the fastest chains in crypto, right? Solana is close at 400 milliseconds. Or these are the fastest blockchains. And again, if you're building something, whether it's for DeFi efficiency or it's for user sanity, if you will, like click that button, I want that answer, you want fast block times. That's number one. Number two is customizability. Your chain, your rules. The really nice thing, by the way, about this community source mechanism is, you know what I didn't mention anywhere? Any sort of other token being inserted into your model, not there. Your chain, your rules, you control your governance. And even if today you don't want it, you think, oh, I know what I want to do and it's fine, control your governance for the future. I think a big mistake people are making is giving up their governance, which is going to, again, stifle innovation. Arbitrum allows you to customize and innovate literally in any way you want. That means you want to add privacy on chain. That means you want to brand your chain a particular way. That means you want to we have chains like Kinto and Plume and Millicent that are doing institutional focused chains and KYC environments in some cases. Go ahead, do it on the Arbitrum chain. And by the way, you're also still a first-class citizen and you're eligible for all sorts of DAO and foundation programs. So that's number two on the technology front. And number three is, which we haven't touched, but it's an old theme of mine, is Arbitrum is the chain and the stack that prioritizes security. From day one, Arbitrum has had fraud proofs live and decentralization. There's one stack that is the leading one when it comes to decentralization and security, and that is Arbitrum. We are continuing that, and we are continuing to build, to stage 2 and beyond, and to bring the world on chain securely. Because you know what? If we succeed in building people on chain, we replace one centralized system with another centralized system, like we've completely failed.
What are we doing here?
We've lost the plot.
In our list of priorities, decentralization and security are number one. Growth, important, but much further down the list, because we have to make sure we're actually doing something interesting and worthy of our times and not just replacing one set of centralized actors with others. And the last thing more broadly is the Arbitrum ecosystem and community. From the very first days of Arbitrum, we employed a fair launch strategy, and that's led to the ethos of the ecosystem where it's collaborative, it's fun, but it's also like, sure, there's a lot of, amazing teams building, so there's always going to be competition, but it's the most collaborative and welcoming ecosystem that I've seen among builders. You can go and take a look at the DAO forum yourselves. You have like examples of, my favorite one is GMX voting for Synthetics funding, like can you, for Synthetics grant. Crazy. If you think about it. But again, this is the collaborative ecosystem, because we recognize that we're not going to succeed by building walls and keeping others out. We're going to succeed by actually executing and building the best products and giving people access to the best crypto ecosystem. And that is Arbitrum, and that's what's going to bring the next million developers and next billion users on chain as we go into 2025 and beyond.
What an ending there, eh?
Yeah. I've seen it on the governance forum. I think it's the lowest barrier of entry, and you can see that one new user, one new unit of liquidity is a net win for everyone in the ecosystem.
Absolutely, yes. And and we are building best-in-class technology, best-in-class Interop. By the way, there are people that said fast. Why would you ship fast withdrawals, right? Let's just keep the users in there for longer. Isn't that great? And the answer is, I don't want any user to be on Arbitrum because they feel locked in there.
Of course
I want users to be able to go and interop wherever they want and come back to Arbitrum because it has real applications for real users and the best user experience that there is. And that's why you should be on Arbitrum, not because anyone's forcing you to be there, but because you want to be there, and it's the best place for you to transact, which I believe for most users and probably for all users today across many, many different verticals, Arbitrum is just the best place to transact in crypto.
Thanks, Steven. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.